Hey everybody, welcome back to JBS. Welcome back to our little trance through all the different genres in the Bible. Last week we looked at history, and this week we're going to be looking at the law. And when I talk about the law, perhaps I should be a little bit more specific. I'm referring specifically to the genre of law, which I think is only present in one book of the Bible, that would be Leviticus, as opposed to the Pentateuch, which would be the first 5 books of the Bible, which is kind of called the Torah in Hebrew, or the law. The law of Moses is kind of all 5 are kind of bundled onto that title of the law of Moses. And even Deuteronomy is kind of referred to as the second law by some. But when I think of law as a genre, I think of Leviticus, and I think that's the main body of law within the Bible. And I think it is actually really important and really cool to look at. Although at first glance it can be very boring, but I think it can be great. It's got some great stuff in there, and I hope that you agree by the end of this little recording. So first step to understanding the law, I think, is to place it in its historical context. And what I mean by that is that the Levitical law is given to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. So this is them coming out of Egypt. They camp at Mount Sinai for Leviticus, and then at Numbers 10 they move on towards the Promised Land. What this means is that the law serves a very important purpose, right? So these Israelites, they've kind of perhaps had stories of a God of their ancestors passed through generations for the 430 years that they've been in Egypt. And now suddenly this God has sent this man Moses, and he has led them out of Egypt. And now the next step is to get to know this God. You know, who is he? What is he about? What is he like? And so I think the law is kind of given as an insight into those questions. You know, they came to Mount Sinai and they're trying to learn who God is. And God is trying to teach them who he is. So when we think about the law, there are 3 kind of main things that come up. There's the sacrifices. They're the big thing that kind of is all throughout the entire book of Leviticus. It's all about sacrifices. And the sacrifices are concerned with the cleanliness and the holiness of Israel. And from that we can kind of get a few things. Firstly, if humans require cleanliness through sacrifices, then it means that humans by definition and by default are not clean. So humans are unclean, and in kind of the modern day Christian kind of terms, we would call them sinful. The uncleanliness comes from the sinfulness of humanity. And so through the sacrifices that are given by God and these directions, we are able to clean ourselves or be made holy. And this is incredibly important because it is an insight into God's character, right? Who is God? Well, he is a righteous and holy God, right? Who longs to be in a relationship with a sinful people. How can a holy God be in a relationship with those sinful, evil, wicked people? Well, if that sinful and evil and wicked people were to clean themselves and make themselves holy, well, then they could be in a relationship. And so, even though you have God's righteousness and humanity's sinfulness, and there's this kind of divide in between that separates them because of sinfulness, God has actually given them a way to get out of that and into a relationship with him through cleanliness and through this law. And so we see God as someone who's longing to be in relationship with his people. And so the law is all about this. It's all about relationship. You know, how does a sinful people relate to a holy God? Well, it is through trying to make themselves holy as possible. And then as we see kind of going forward, that holiness is then supposed to be obvious to the nations around them and point the other people towards God as well. Fortunately, that doesn't happen because Israel is not good at being holy. And we can kind of see this especially in kind of the Ten Commandments, how it's all about relationship, right? Have no other gods before me. God is the God. He is the one that you are in a relationship with. He is the one who has saved you. He is the one who loves you. And so he is the one that you are to spend your time being in a relationship with. Even the classic one that kind of gets dismissed nowadays, do not covet your neighbor's ox, is another one that's fun. Do not want other people's things, which is different from do not steal, because do not steal is the actual act of thievery, whereas coveting is just really wanting stuff. And so in that, there's a message that if you focus too much on what is here on earth and the things that you want, then you'll ignore the kind of the heavenly things. You'll ignore God, and you'll start to fill your life with material things instead. And God warns against that, because he wants relationship with his people, and vice versa. But let's go forward now into my little tips and tricks for how to read the law. First big tip, and I think this is something that people get wrong quite a lot, but God is not setting up a works-based salvation. He isn't, right? The salvation of the Old Testament Israelites is through Jesus' death on the cross. They just don't know about it yet, and they are saved through their faith in God, not through obedience to the law, right? What's going on there is that they're trying to figure out how to live as God's people. So I'm going to stray into my second tip here to explain this as well. So second tip is that the Levitical Israelites mimic modern day Christians almost perfectly, right? They've had this great salvation event in Exodus, then they've gone out, and now they're in the desert, and they have to figure out, what does it mean to be the saved people of God? And while they're trying to figure that out, they are also looking forward into a new the promised land that God has promised for them. Entering into this area to make their own. And for the modern day Christians, we have this great salvation event on the cross, and now we live in this time where we need to figure out what it means to live as a member of the saved people of God, while looking forward to the promised land in the new creation. There's almost a perfect mimicry there, except that the Old Testament Israelites go to the Levitical law and what it tells them about God and how they can relate to him, whereas we would go to the New Testament letters, where people like Paul and Peter and John tell us about who Jesus is and how to be in relationship with him, through prayer, through thanksgiving, and through kind of baptism and the sacraments and all of the stuff that's going on there, and especially through faith and grace. That's really the only big difference between those two areas, as well as quite a few. But point is, number two, they are very much like you, very similar. They're trying their best to be as sinless as possible, trying to be the people that God wants them to be, but it's hard. And it's very easy to slam on them for that, but it's also harder to recognize those faults within yourself. So perhaps when you're looking at the Old Testament Israelites, perhaps you should see a bit of yourself in them. And then the kind of number one that I was bringing out was that they've already been saved, right? It's not a works-based salvation, because they've already been saved from Egypt, and now they've got to figure out what it means to be a people of God. Goodness. Tip number 3. This is a guide on how to be sinless, right? It's not a guide on how to have the perfect society. It's not what it's about. It's not about how to build an empire. It's not about how to be great and make a name for yourselves. It's about how to be sinless. And I think anybody who has tried to be sinless realizes that it is incredibly difficult thing to be attempting. And so when we read the law, we try to think of this massive list of things. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. But that's not really the case. It's more of this is how you be holy. Please be holy. I want you to be holy so that I can be with you, as God says to the Israelites. And then we kind of get to the Pharisees at the end we get to the Pharisees in the New Testament, and they look at the law and they say, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. But then Jesus shows up and he's like, actually, it's not a set of like hard legalistic things you have to follow. It's all about being in a relationship with God, being able to love him and obey him rather than obeying the law itself. Number 4, you want to look beyond the minutiae and towards the big points. So, does it really matter that you need to prepare the oils in this very specific way and then apply them to these very specific parts of the body, the ankles, the wrists, the forehead? Does that really matter? Not so much. The thing that really matters is that is a part of a sin offering. And it's a sin offering that you must do if you are diseased, for example. And then the big question there is, if you are diseased, why do you need a sin offering? So you want to look past the little minutiae. Some of it can be important, but the big points are the things that you really want to focus on, kind of the general and broad views that have some really interesting reflections there, if you're able to look past that. And number 5, how does the law apply to us today? For one thing, it teaches us about God, the things about his character that we learn. His yearning to be in a relationship with humans, that's true. But specifically, the law can be divided into 3 different categories. The first one is the national law, so the laws of Israel. These laws do not apply to Christians today because God's people is no longer made up of a nation, they are now made up of all nations. The second category is the sacrificial laws, which are fulfilled through the death of Jesus on the cross. And then the third category is the moral law, which are the 10 commandments. And of all these 3 laws, the one that the Christians should be following are the 10 commandments. They are the ones that are still relevant for Christians today to obey. And mainly it's because it sets a mindset within the believer to be putting God above all else. And that is the main point of the law, is to try and put God first in your life before yourself, and try to humble yourself, acknowledge yourself as a sinful person, and trying to fix that through obedience to God, and cleaning yourself through the law to be presented holy so that you can be in a relationship with God. I hope that helped. Law is difficult to think about and even harder to read, but we do have more homework this week. This time, I want you to read through Leviticus chapter 14, 1 through to 32. So just the cleansing from defiling skin diseases. I want you to read that little section throughout the week, kind of meditate on it, think about it a lot, and then come to me, a youth group, and tell me what you learned. Tell me what you learned about reading, what you learned from Leviticus through reading through those little tips. But yeah, I look forward to that. I will see you guys then, and have a good week, guys. Enjoy.